Hi, Sonia. Hi. Nice to see you. Good. How are you?
Am I audible? Well, you're right in front of me, of course. Effort to our unceasing efforts to move the Armenian community towards punctuality. Well, we're going to try to get started within shouting distance of 8 o'clock. And first thing I'd like to do is welcome you to our Christmas open house. It's December 8th. It feels a little bit early to be saying that, but on the other hand, when it didn't snow today or what have you, I was very glad that we did it a little bit earlier because it's a little bit nerve-wracking this time of year because, well, anyway, you know the story. I would like to welcome you to our talk tonight as well, and the first thing I'd like to do is to ask our chairman, Rafi Agayan, to come up and to say a few words.
One of the reasons for holding the open house this early in the month is to give you time to wrap it and give it as gifts. We need to give you ample time to do your Christmas shopping.
Public event is okay.
Have the packages ready for Santa. Thank you. I also want to welcome you all for this occasion, both the open house and listening to our esteemed guest speaker. Let me recap a little bit of a story. When we went on the trip together in 2006, Paul Ignatius at that point was a little bit worrisome for us. How is this old man going to climb up all the ruins and everything? And he surprised us all. He put us at rest by clambering ahead of everybody up steep slopes, and so it's good to see Paul still in good spirits and up and around. And it was very nice to have Adi as his son and Sarah, his daughter, along with that trip, which was a memorable one for NAASR as well as the group of travelers we had together. So I welcome you to this thing and do my usual reminder that NAASR depends on your membership support. And please, if you're not a member, there are copies of membership application on every seat, so you have them handy. Please fill them out and feel free to support NAASR in its efforts to make the public aware of the Armenian heritage, Armenian literature, Armenian history, and any aspect of Armenian studies that we're trying to support. Welcome again, and we'll proceed with the rest of the program. Mark will take over.
It's bad form to correct the chairman, but actually what you have on your chairs are gift membership forms. If you would like to give the gift of a NAASR membership, which we would of course encourage you to do, you may use this. If you are not a NAASR member and would like to become one, of course we have just regular old membership forms out on the front desk, and thanks for your support. Two announcements to make. Next Wednesday, December 14th, we are pleased to be partnering with the Armenian Club of Watertown High School, the ARF Boston Sardarabad Gomide, the Armenian International Women's Association to present Suzanne Kardalian's documentary film, Grandma's Tattoos, at 7 p.m. at the Watertown Middle School auditorium. The director, Suzanne Kardalian, will be present the evening of the screening and will speak and have a Q&A session following the film. The film itself runs for just under an hour, and even though it's being shown at the middle school, it's fair to issue the warning that it contains, as they say, adult themes and language and may not be appropriate for children. It's a very powerful film. It's if you go and you watch it, I am sure you will be as deeply affected by it as I was. So I would encourage you to do so. And an extra announcement on the following day, December 15th, our friends at the Armenian Library and Museum of America will present a lecture by Professor James Russell entitled The Bells, from Poe to Sardarabad at the Alma, at the museum in Watertown Square. And I will be there and hope to see you there as well. So, I need only to say a few words of introduction for our speaker tonight, Mr. Paul Ignatius, since he's going to tell us quite a bit about himself anyway. And there's a great deal more besides in his book, Now I Know in Part. But in brief, Paul is a descendant of Armenian parents from the Kharpert region, and is himself a native of Glendale, California. It's not the Glendale of today. It was a different Glendale, and it wasn't. Glendale is synonymous now with Armenians, but I don't think it really was in Paul's day. He's shaking his head in affirmation of that. He is a proud graduate of the University of Southern California, and he earned an MBA from Harvard University after serving as a naval officer during World War II. Paul served for 8 years in the presidential administrations of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, first as an Assistant Secretary of the Army, then as Undersecretary of the Army and Assistant Secretary of Defense, and finally in 1967 as Secretary of the Navy. Following his government service, he was president of the Washington Post Corporation for 2 years and president of the Air Transport Association for 15 years. He's the recipient of the Army Distinguished Civilian Service Award, the Navy Distinguished Public Service Award, and the Department of Defense Distinguished Public Service Award, which is a good collection of distinguished public service awards. He is the author of 2 memoirs, Now I Know in Part, and On Board, My Life in the Navy, Government and Business. Now I Know in Part was originally privately published in 2000. And a couple of years ago, I think it was, Paul approached me about the possibility of publishing a revised and expanded edition of this book. I had read Now I Know in Part, and I found it a really very engaging, well-written, and informative memoir. So after a little back and forth, discussing things, we agreed that it would be a great project for NAASR. And even though most of what we do here has a scholarly orientation, and Now I Know in Part is not a scholarly work, but a memoir, such memoirs, and in particular, for my money, a memoir like this that provides a window into Armenian-American life is very valuable and important itself. I want to mention, too, that the process of writing the book, creating the book, went very smoothly because of Paul's hard work and also because of the excellent work of Mark McCurtich, the designer of the book jacket, and he did fantastic work. You have all seen Mark's work at the Armenian Mirror Spectator and elsewhere, and he really made this project a much more appealing one because of his excellent work. Now that I've embarrassed Mark, I can now move on. I first met Paul when he was invited to speak at NAASR's 50th anniversary celebration in 2006, the same year he traveled on the Armenian Heritage Tour that Rafi mentioned before. I should mention that as early as 1962, our files here are very complete. Manuk Young had tried to get Paul to speak at a NAASR banquet. But on that occasion, and on a number of subsequent ones, he sent his cordial regrets. So he was playing hard to get, and in 2006, we were finally able to get him to say yes. Getting to know Paul and his wife, Nancy, throughout the process of preparing the book has been a real pleasure for me, something that I will always value greatly, and I hope their frequent visits here will not diminish in frequency. Paul is not only an extremely accomplished and successful, highly respected figure, he's also an interesting person and a thoroughly nice guy. He is also, and I say this not to embarrass him, at age 91, an inspiration to someone a little less than half his age. It doesn't really even make sense when you say it, but nonetheless, those are the facts. I know that because it's in the book. So suffice it to say that personally and for NAASR as an organization, we're extremely proud to be the publisher of this new edition of Now I Know in Part. And before I ask Paul to take over, I want to acknowledge and express my appreciation not only for his presence here, but for the presence tonight of a large part of his family. His wonderful wife, Nancy Ignatius, his son, Adi, his daughter, Amy, his daughter, Sarah, her husband, Dan Kesselbrenner, and their son, Joel Kesselbrenner. They're even sitting in the order that I wrote them down. That's weird. Anyway. Delighted that you're here, and after our speaker has the floor, I would certainly invite any of you up to speak who wish to add anything or rebut anything or expand upon anything, and it'll be an open mic night for the Ignatius family. We have plenty of time. So please welcome Mr. Paul Ignatius.
Well, first, I'm just absolutely delighted to be here, and from a personal standpoint, it's very meaningful for me because more than 50 years ago, my father, Josep Ignatius, was one of many people who helped to raise money to establish the chair at Harvard, and then subsequently he did the same thing in California for the UCLA chair of Armenian Studies. So it's a very real privilege for me to follow a half century or more later in his footsteps. And in that regard, I'm really happy to say that whatever sales of this book may occur, and I hope there will be a lot of them, the full amount will be going to NAASR. I will receive no income from it. And I feel very good about that because I think NAASR is a really fine organization that helps to perpetuate this long, long history of the Armenian people. I think one of the most remarkable things about being an Armenian is to realize that so many older civilizations that may have existed at the time that the Armenian people inhabited the earth have disappeared. They're gone, forgotten. But the Armenians are still there. They're still here in the United States, in the Republic of Armenia, and throughout the world. Nan, my wife, and I were some years ago on a trip in Singapore, and we were going to visit the horticultural garden when I saw that one of the big tourist attractions was the Armenian church in Singapore. Why is there an Armenian church in Singapore, which is made up of Malay people and Chinese people and so forth? And when we went to visit the church, we found it was on a street called Armenia Street. Later on, we learned that the leading hotel in Singapore, Raffles, was founded by an Armenian. The flower of Singapore is an orchid, and the woman who grew the orchid was an Armenian woman, and there were never more than a handful of Armenian people in this largely Asian place, but they created so many of the main institutions, including the leading newspaper, the Straits Times, not only in Singapore, but throughout that area. So this is one faraway example of how Armenians continue to do wonderful things. There are a number of people here tonight who were on that trip, beginning with Chairman Rafi Ban, Arroy and Dr. Nishan, and perhaps missed others. Oh, Nancy, who was chairman of NAASR at the time and responsible in so many ways for that trip. I must say that's the best trip I ever made. I hope that NAASR will do that again. My daughter Sarah was on that trip, and my son Adi, and we just had a marvelous time. We learned a lot. And to emphasize what I've said about the importance of NAASR, and also the importance of that trip. Sarah wants to say a few words, and I think that's important because to carry on this organization, later generations have to do what all of you have done to bring it into being and to continue it. And you know, Sarah's not all that young, but her son is here, and these. And so it's younger people coming along who are important to perpetuate the contributions that NAASR's making. So Sarah, why don't you come up for a minute, and then I'll talk a little bit about the book.
Okay, hi everybody. So this is my father's night, so I don't want to take too much time. But I did want to say how much it means to me to be here tonight at NAASR with all of you as Pop presents his memoir, published by NAASR. It couldn't be more fitting. For me, NAASR opened the door to my own Armenian past. So we grew up knowing that we were half Armenian, but we didn't really know what that meant. I knew that Armenia was between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea because my grandfather had pointed that out to me on a map when I visited him in Southern California when I was 19. And he told me that at about the same age that I was at that time, that he had left Harper, which is where he was from, and that he'd gone over land to the Black Sea and out through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles into the Mediterranean. And when he told me that, his eyes lit up, remembering that, even though for him it was probably about 60 years later that he was telling me that. So we knew some stories from Pop, some of which you'll probably hear tonight, but I didn't know all the rest. So the first book that I read about the genocide was after college when I was in Montana, living in Montana of all places, and I checked the book out of the library. Maybe you've read this, Neither to Laugh Nor to Weep. So now, having been to Armenia, the independent country, and Historic Armenia on the tour with NAASR, and standing on a hillside with my father and my brother Adi, in the town where my grandfather was born, and seeing nothing but rock and rough grass, where a thriving city of over 30,000 people had once lived, and where a college of over a dozen sturdy buildings had once stood. I saw the ribbon of blue in the distance, the Euphrates River, and I felt the cool breeze blowing in from the snow-capped mountains that surround the town. And I felt that it was both to laugh and to weep, to breathe the same air and to feel my ancestors' presence, to still be with me, to merge my Armenian past with my equally strong and hardworking New England roots through my mother. All of this is an amazing gift, and I owe it all to NAASR. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. I want to acknowledge one other person here tonight, Elsie Jangochin, a cousin of mine, whose married name is the same name as my mother's maiden name. My grandfather was Avedis Matios Jangochin, my mother was Elisa Jangochin, and Elsie I haven't seen for many years, and she's here with her daughter and her grandson. I'm especially pleased that you were here. I'm going to review parts of the book, read little bits of it to give you a flavor. But before I begin, I want to thank Mark Momigonia. You have a real gem in Mark running this organization. I don't have to tell you that. He shepherded the project through, very helpful comments, and I really enjoyed working with him, and he and I have become good friends. So I thank you very much for your work and for the fine design. I thank you also. Let me tell you a little bit first about my family. My grandfather's name was Avedis Matios Jamgochan. He lived in Egin. He was a member of a prominent family there who distributed Manchester cotton goods in the Ottoman Empire. They had a store and they distributed generally, and they lived well. He was one of the first graduates of Euphrates College in Harper, and just as a sideline, I think that one of the finest things that we've ever done in the United States is to found some of these colleges in the Middle East, Robert College and Istanbul Euphrates College, AUB in both Cairo and Lebanon. These places have trained professionals for generation after generation and have made lasting contributions to their countries. And interestingly enough, a lot of the impetus for this came from really where we are now, from Massachusetts, from Mount Holyoke College, from many of the churches in the New England area who sponsored missionaries over there who founded these schools. As I say, my grandfather was one of the early graduates. Some years later, my father was a graduate of Euphrates College. And both my grandfather and my father learned English when they were there, so that when they came to this country, they were well prepared to take their place in this different country that spoke a language different from the one they grew up with. My grandfather stayed on as a kind of graduate student there. He translated Milton's Paradise Lost into Armenian, and he also wrote some poetry. And in the poetry, he had some forbidden words like freedom and liberty, and he was discovered. And he got into real trouble with the Ottoman authorities. And the family was able to free him, but they packed him off to England, to Manchester, where the family had business connections because they were distributing Manchester cotton goods. Manchester was the world leader in the manufacture of cotton goods. So he went there in 1892 with my mother, Elisa, and his second child, Matthew, was born. And they lived in England for almost 20 years. My grandfather became a British subject, actually. In 1895 and 96, there were the Hamidian massacres, and my grandfather's family, the male members, were wiped out. His brother's sons, my grandmother's father were all killed. And my grandfather was safe in England. He left there in 1892, and there was always a sadness about him, and I think it was partly because he knew that he was safe while his closest members of his family were killed. He became a prosperous merchant in Manchester. Those of you who know about Manchester know that this was a thriving Armenian colony. Dikran Kuumjan, better known to the world as Michael Ireland, was from Manchester. My mother knew him when she was a teenager there. They'd go to parties. There were a number of important and fine people and very prosperous merchants. The first chapter of the Parakorzagan, Armenian, the General Benevolent Union, was formed in Manchester. My grandfather was one of 3 or 4 people who formed it. There was a man named Topalian, a good friend, who was another one. And this was the first chapter outside of Cairo where the organization was first formed in, I believe, 1908, was it? And then a year later, the Manchester chapter was formed. The weather disagreed with my grandfather, and he came to California in 1911 in a place called Tropico that later became Glendale. It was absorbed into the town of Glendale. Those of you who've been out there know there's a big cemetery called Forest Lawn Memorial Park, a rather famous place. And Tropico was right in that area. And my grandfather was fairly well off, and he bought a lot of property and built a big house. There's a picture of it in the book, and a tennis court, and lived quite well. The house burned down in 1927, but I remember it. I was old enough to have remembered it. My grandfather was a wonderful man, but a terrible investor. He put most of his money into businesses that he never had any business getting involved with. But he had one asset that remained, and it was, of all things, a soap factory. And so at the age of, I don't know, 55 or 60, he went back to work as head of the California Soap Company. One of his sons was a student at the University of California studying to be an architect. He pulled him back, and this particular son became sort of head of research, reporting to himself. There was no one else in the department, and his other son, Matthew. And it became a pretty good small business that was able to support this large family, and it was quite a change from what he expected to do. My father, Hofseth Bohos Ignatius, came to the United States in 1904. His older brothers preceded him, coming after the Hamidian massacres. His family was not affected by those terrible events, but his family knew that if it happened once, it could happen again. And so they thought the older sons ought to leave, and fortunately they were able to come to the United States. My father followed them several years later in 1904 and went to Pittsburgh, went to a business college in Poughkeepsie, New York, and later lived in West Virginia, made a trip to California, and happened to have met my mother on that trip and fell in love with her and said, I'm going to pull up stakes in West Virginia and go out to California. And he wooed my mother, who was then a student at the University of Southern California, and they got married in 1919. My father had one foot in the American business community and the other foot very much in the community of Armenian affairs. He became, I think it's fair to say, the leader of the Armenian community in Los Angeles. There wasn't a banquet to recognize the celebrity at which my father wasn't the Toastmaster. There wasn't a charity that he didn't somehow help to establish. There's a home for Armenian older people in a museum out in the extreme part of the San Fernando Valley, and there's a plaque at that museum where my father's name is listed with several others as founders of this particular place. He and my mother started something called the Armenian Allied Arts Association, which still exists some 75 or 80 years after it started. And its purpose was to identify promising young boys and girls of Armenian parentage in music, and various forms of music, singing, instrumentation, writing, and one of the prized awards each year is one in honor of my parents. I want to read something that follows on what I've said, which is a tribute to my father from Leon Sermelian, who I think is probably, after William Saroyan, the best Armenian writing in English. And Zaven was a very close friend of the families. I knew him well, and I'll read some of what he had to say after my father died. He said, it is too late now to write a history of the Armenian community in Los Angeles because Hofseth is dead. He was its living history. He knew everybody and everything. He was a lion of a man. Every Armenian who came to Los Angeles and had anything to do with the arts or with politics went to his office. He was not a wealthy man, but he was a bon vivant by nature. He bought his clothes at Oviat's, the finest store in Los Angeles. He bought paintings he couldn't afford, but even if, particularly if the painter was an Armenian, he had an air of well-being and confidence about him. He spoke perfect English and remained faithful to the tribe. My sister once said to my father, "You were lucky to have come to America." And my father smiled at her and said, "America is lucky to have me." Well, let me now turn to Glendale. As Mark said, Glendale was different. So far as I know, my grandfather, Abadish John Gochin, may have been the first one to buy property there. I don't know that for sure, but it may be the case. And at any rate, I went to public school there, including through high school, Hoover High School. And I think the only Armenian kids there were my sister and my brother and me. If you go there now, I would guess 45%, maybe half of the kids in school and of the people who live in Glendale are Armenian. It's a complete transformation. At any rate, let me give you a little flavor of what it was like to be in kindergarten in these old days. The great conductors of the concert stage were instrumentalists once. Serge Kusevitsky played the double bass, Toscanini was a cellist, and Leopold Stokowski an organist. Before taking up the baton to lead the kindergarten orchestra at the Eugene Field School, I too had been an instrumentalist. I played Quaker Oats box, a percussion instrument consisting of the well-known cardboard cereal container filled with small pebbles. When shaken smartly, it provided a rhythmic counterpart to the other musicians playing their tin kazoos, toy trumpets, and kiddie flutes. On normal school days, the orchestra performed without a leader. On Parents' Day, our teacher thought we should have a real proper conductor and chose me. Perhaps because I played Quaker Oats box poorly, but as I like to think, perhaps because I had demonstrated outstanding leadership qualities even at that early age. The orchestra members took their places on the small stage, and the parents sat uncomfortably in the little chairs out front, eagerly waiting for the concert to begin. Then the teacher sent me to the center of the stage and told me to start the music. I did, facing the audience and flapping my arms about me while the tin kazoos and the trumpets and the flutes sounded the first notes. The audience, including my parents, began to laugh, and the teacher, seeing the problem, came on stage and turned me around so that I faced the orchestra. None of the kindergarten musicians missed a single note. It was a splendid example of the professionalism that orchestra members are sometimes called upon to demonstrate when the conductor loses his place in the score or commits some other blunder. Well, you can see that that was a great start in life and maybe a highlight. I want to then talk a little bit about what it was like to live in a home where so many interesting people, friends of my parents, came. And I really felt that I was so much better off than my schoolmates who led more prosaic lives. Let me just read again from the book a little bit here. One of the great pleasures, I say, was meeting these unusual friends, mostly Armenian friends of my parents. With the neighborhood kids, I would walk to school, go to class, eat lunch from a paper bag, and then walk home, horse around for a couple of hours before dinner. And in the evening, friends like Hugh Russell next door spent some time with members of his extended family. Or Jack Eddy, who lived several houses up the street, saw his parents and sometimes boring business acquaintances of his father, but not me. I saw people like Tom Kalugian. Now, who is Tom Kalugian? Tom Kalugian was a rug man, but he didn't sell the one magnificent rug he owned. It was a big, maybe 10 by 14 rug, and he became famous, and the rug became famous, because in World War I, he put this rug on the gangplank as the division commanded by General MacArthur embarked to fight World War I, the war to end all wars at that time. And he collected the dust from this is a true story. He collected the dust from the boots of these soldiers and he put it in mason jars, and he went around the country and distributed all of this, and later arranged to have this same rug under the Liberty Bell, the symbol of America's democracy, in Philadelphia, and the rug then became known as the Liberty Bell rug. And Tom would appear at the openings of markets and various civic events with his rug. And he came to our house frequently because he was a friend of my father's. One of the things he said was that the Armenian language came from English. And he would take a word like, what is the word for rice? Prince? Well, he says that sounds like prince. And so and I was just a young kid, and I asked my father, did any of this make any sense? And my father said, just don't take it too seriously. But there were many other people. In 1933, William Saroyan had written his first book, The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze. And my parents gave a book party for him. And he came, and there were a lot of people there, and they were asking him all kinds of questions. And he finally wasn't enjoying this at all. And he came to me, I might have been 13 years old or something, and my brother Joe was maybe 8 or 9. And he says, is there any way we can get out of here and go somewhere and read the funny papers? And there was a maid's room in our house down the hall. You'd kind of get lost there. And we took Willie there, and we started reading the Katzenjammer Kids and other comics of the day. And Saroyan would act out, he was a young guy then, and he would act out the parts, and we were having a great old time until my father discovered us there and dragged him back to the party. One thing I remember from William Saroyan was that he always carried a notebook, and when someone said something that he found colorful or interesting, he'd write it down. His uncle, Aram Saroyan, was my father's best friend, and Aram was himself a most unusual figure, a lawyer and a grape shipper who became quite wealthy in his day. And if you've read the book, My Name is Aram, which I personally think is the best thing William Saroyan ever wrote, Aram was figured in many of those stories. But he would come from Fresno to Los Angeles several times a year and come to our house. And he was famous for telling stories, some of which, Rafi, you may remember I told on the 2006 trip. We had to travel over some of the worst roads in the world on this trip, not by NAASR's choice, but because the Turkish government would not allow us to cross the border and go into historic Armenia. We had to go way north through Georgia and then come all the way back down again in order to go to a place that, had we been able to do it directly, would have been a matter of 20 minutes or so. And on this trip, sometimes to avoid the bumpy roads, you know, you go at the astonishing speed of 5 miles an hour sometimes on these roads. They were so bad. We would tell stories. Adi one day entertained the group with a story about his time when he was the Wall Street Journal's bureau chief in Moscow, about a Soviet economist who was asked at a convention once, if you had to describe the economy in one word, what would you say? And the Soviet economist said, good. And he was then asked, what if you had to describe it in 2 words? He said, not good. And despite Professor Bernutyan's scholarly lectures, I think Adi's presentation was one of the best. I told some Aram Saroyan stories, and which I won't go into here, but they're mentioned in the book. Let me just say a word about Armenian food. Is there anything so good? I mean, really. We had some Armenian food. It's a very labor-intensive cuisine, isn't it? It takes so long, and my mother could cook some of the good dishes, but she had so many other interests that we tended to kind of take shortcuts and eat cream tuna or a steak now and again or whatever. But my cousin George was a marvelous, absolutely marvelous cook. Nobody could cook shish kebab like George Ignatius. And every 2 or 3 months he'd have a party at his house in Los Angeles, and it would begin, and you'd have a whole meal really before you got to the hot food, with all kinds of cheeses and appetizers, dolma, whatever. And then the shish kebab came, and the lamb was the finest quality available, the seasonings enticing, the portions he pressed on his guests enormous, with rice pilaf to absorb the juices from the meat, vegetables grilled over the open fire, and a salad of tomatoes, cucumbers, parsley, and onions, dressed with lemon juice and olive oil. Am I making you hungry? It was a meal to savor and remember. And after dinner, everybody sipped coffee, and George fell asleep. I mention in the book 2 Armenian restaurants, neither of which exist any longer. One in New York called the Golden Horn, which was run by a man named Aram Salesian, who was a friend of my family's from Pasadena, who moved east and later started the Golden Horn. It was right in Rockefeller Center. Where the restaurant is now a tall skyscraper, but it was just superb. I met Michael Arlen one night at that restaurant. He lived nearby at the St. Regis Hotel, and he used to come to the Golden Horn quite often for dinner. The other one was George Mardikyan's restaurant out in San Francisco, and called Omar Khayyam's. And again, Mardikyan was a friend of my father's and would come to town. And once there was a singer in the 1930s, maybe in the 40s, called Rudy Valet. He was from I think from New England, if I remember right. But he was a singer, Broadway stage and so on. And he loved Armenian food. And he asked George Mardikyan if he would prepare a meal for him. And so Mardikyan came to our house and cooked the meal there, and I watched him preparing it, and then I went to his restaurant many times later. But those places are gone. Where I live in Washington, there are many Middle Eastern restaurants, Lebanese and otherwise, but there are no Armenian restaurants. You can only get true Armenian food there at the church, and once or twice a year they will hold a church meeting. You can't live in California without being enamored of automobiles. You are what you drive, as people say in California. So I had to include a chapter in the book that I called simply Cars. And the main element in this chapter is about my father's brother, Uncle Lou. And Uncle Lou was perhaps the most feared man to all of the Detroit automotive manufacturers. Now, he was actually a very mild-mannered man. He drank a little more, I think, than should have, but he was a lovely man. But why would a soft-spoken, nice man like this be so feared in Detroit? And the answer was simple. No matter what car he bought, the company went out of business. he bought a Haynes. Anybody ever heard of it? He bought a Romer. He bought an Essex. He bought a Jordan. He bought a Nash. And every one of those companies bit to death. None of them survived. So they stood, the Detroit people stood in terror. My God, he's not going to buy one of our, because it would have spelled their doom. My father drove a wonderful Cadillac. It was a blue open touring car, and he would get into the handsome automobile dressed in an Alexander and Oviatt suit with the Borsellino hat on his bald head, and the watch chain that my mother had given him spanned the girth of his midsection, and he would drive off to his office or his club or to see a friend. It was a fine sight, and Mr. Russell on one side of our house and Mr. Hastings on the other side looked on not so much in envy, but with pride in knowing that they lived next door to this open touring Cadillac car and its resplendent driver. Now my brother was a surgeon, and he made enough money to do what many people would want to do. He bought a magnificent Mercedes-Benz 280 SE convertible. There never was a more beautiful car than this, and he still has it. And it was always maintained by a German mechanic who left Stuttgart and came to Palo Alto, California. And he looked after my brother's car and other Mercedes automobiles in his shop in Palo Alto. One day, a man with a Chevy drove into this man's, German man, his name was Hartmut, drove into Hartmut's shop, trouble with his car. He said his Chevy was not acting well. Hartmut looked at the man, then looked at the Chevy, and said, "We don't work on foreign cars." There's a long chapter in the book about the 4 years I spent in the Navy, and I'll just hit one or two quick highlights. I spent most of my time on a ship called the Manila Bay in the war against the Japanese, and it was a very good ship. One of the things that I think really made it possible for the United States to triumph along with its allies in the Second War was the ability of the American economy to respond in just incredible ways. One example of it, we lost our Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor yesterday, or it was Pearl Harbor, wasn't it? We raised some of those ships from the mud at Pearl Harbor and sent them to sea again. And in the meantime, we built a whole new fleet of Enterprise carriers and Iowa-class battleships. And the Japanese began the war with the best equipment, the best torpedo tactics, the best aerial torpedo tactics, but they couldn't respond when they sustained losses. And we simply overwhelmed them. And that was, I think, why the kamikazes, you may remember the suicide pilots who struck naval ships, we say they were fanatics to have done that. And my own feeling is that the Japanese had a dwindling asset. They couldn't rebuild to replace their losses as we were able to do. And so they had to make the most out of what they had. So if you could trade one airplane and one aviator for one aircraft carrier, that was a pretty good thing. And so these planes came out beginning in the Philippines campaign and then at Okinawa and other places. And my ship, the Manila Bay, was hit by 2 of these guys, but we were able to save the ship. And for a whole lot of reasons, some of this is luck, some of it is the Almighty looking down favorably, but also the foresight of our captain. Now, I describe all of this in the book. I won't go into it now. When the war ended, I came back to get my MBA, finish my school at the Harvard Business School, and met my wife, who was a classmate of my sister's at Wellesley College. And we got married, and I stayed on the staff at Harvard for several years, and then started in 1950 a company called Harborage House, beginning in Harvard Square, but ultimately we were down on Arlington Street looking out on the public garden. The building is still there, and it says Harborage House on it, but it's now very expensive condominiums. It's on the corner of Arlington and Commonwealth Avenue, right near the Ritz Hotel. I had left the company by then to go into the government, so I didn't benefit when they sold that, which I suspect they sold at a pretty good price. Let me talk about a couple of things that I have advocated and that I think are important. There are many places, notably here in this area, where there's a museum in Watertown, other places where Armenian history and culture are indicated, but I have often thought that there could be a very large and well-financed museum. I would call it the American Museum of Armenian Achievement or something like that, where, you know, I was hoping we could get a big grant from someone like Kirk Kerkorian who had the money, and they, you know, whether that's still possible, I don't know, but I am just so taken with the accomplishments of Armenian people in the arts and in business and in government, and so I've written about this, and it's all in the book. But what I had in mind was you'd have one section of this museum on Armenian political figures, Nubar Pasha, Prime Minister of Egypt. Anastas Mikoyan, who was a survivor in the Soviet Union, George Dukmedin, the governor of California, and others who come to mind. Armenian artists and writers, including Arshil Gorky, William Soroyan, Sharentz, Rafi, Ruben Nakyan, Michael Arlen, Michael J. Arlen, Peter Balakian, and many others. Armenian theatrical people, Ruben Mamoulian, Akim Tamirov, Armand Tokatyan, Charles Aznavour, Aram Khachaturian, and many others. And Armenian business leaders, including Kalis Gulbenkian, Kirk Kerkorian, Kay Arakelian, Alex Mondigyan, Kevin Kovanyan, and others. And I thought you could get lots of artifacts from the lives and accomplishments of these people. You could have continuous movie scripts from some of Mamoulian's movies. You could have the Willie Soroyan's typewriters on which he wrote his many stories. You could have reproductions, probably not originals, because nobody could afford them now, of Arshil Gorky's works, and so forth. And you could have naming opportunities. I would think Alex Manukyan might, and his family, his son, might want to sponsor perhaps that part of the museum that dealt with Armenian business. So I still hope something like this will come to pass. Many of my friends, when they hear the word Armenian, either remember that phrase from the past about the starving Armenians, or they know that the genocide of the Armenians is the overwhelming event in the memories of so many of us. And without in any way diminishing the seriousness of those things, they shouldn't overshadow the other enormous accomplishments that this small, historically important nation, this survival nation, if you will, has made and continues to make. So that's one thing that I would like to see. Another thing on the trip in 2006, we visited Ani, the medieval capital of Armenia. Those of you who've been there know it's a vast place, enormous, but the whole place is in ruins. It's just in ruins. There is something in the world called the United Nations historical places. Angkor Wat in Cambodia is a very good example of this. My wife and I have been to Angkor Wat, and these great Khmer temples have been restored to the point, not completely, but to the point where you can appreciate the magnitude and the magnificence of the Khmer Empire. And in Ani there were cathedrals, there were churches, there were frescoes, there were monuments, and this is a place of world importance. And I believe that it should be restored. I would hope that it could be restored as a joint effort by both the Republic of Armenia and by the Turkish Republic. It's now, of course, in part of Turkish land, but it was a historically important place, not only for Armenia but for the world. And the Turks have done something at Akhtamar. We visited, didn't we, Rafi, that? And one of the really offensive things about this trip was that when we visited places like the church at Akhtamar and Ani, there was never anything in the signage that indicated the Armenian identification with the places. It was as though the Armenians never existed. And I was offended by that. I know, when I was in England, I saw Hadrian's Wall. It didn't say England's Wall, or it didn't say here's this old stone wall. It said this was Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian was a Roman. But the British identify it as what it was. It was Hadrian, the Roman's wall. So this leads me to the question really of this whole business of denial of what happened in 1915 and earlier that in 1895 and 1996. I mentioned earlier that a number of members of my family on both my mother's and my father's side lost their lives in one or the other of those horrible events. And I suspect many of you in this audience, perhaps most of you, have ancestors who have similar stories to tell. But let me just say a little bit from the book where I talk about some of this. I say Turkey is an important country today. It is closely allied with the United States through NATO and other connections. It has maintained a secular government opposed to religious fanaticism. Though its human rights record is far from perfect, its government is chosen through an electoral process with vibrant participation from its citizens. Its geographic location at the juncture of East and West has always given it an added dimension and will continue to do so as events evolve in the Caucasus and the Middle East. Because Turkey is so important, I cannot understand why it seems impossible for it to acknowledge, as Armenians and non-Armenians have urged for so long, the genocide of 1915 and the massacres which preceded it. Great countries have it within their power to declare when they have done wrong or offended the common decency. The Germans have come to terms with their Nazi past and have become a respected nation once again. The Japanese have begun to acknowledge their barbaric treatment of the Korean comfort women and have taken other steps to atone for their militaristic leaders who participated in the aggression in the Pacific. The United States has apologized to its citizens of Japanese origin for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Why can't the Turkish Republic acknowledge the atrocities of its Ottoman predecessors, and then hold its head high among the family of nations? Instead, it pretends that what happened in 1895 and 1915 really didn't happen. And I go on to say that it is, in my opinion, at any rate, it is very much in Turkey's interest to remove the stain of blood from its history, and it is also very much in the interest of Armenians. Armenians are a gifted people, as I've said earlier, who have survived for centuries while many other ancient peoples have vanished. They should be free to look forward, not back, to forgive but not to forget, to prepare their small struggling nation for its future in harmony with Turkey and other countries in their area of the world. Perhaps a reconciliation in the interest of the Turks and the Armenians, so overdue and so needed, will finally come to pass as the new century unfolds. And after that, and inspired partly, I think, by the NAASR trip, I tried to think through some of this myself. I'm a newcomer to this. I'm not skilled or knowledgeable like many of you are, or Professor Tanner, a marvelous man, and his book, A Shameful Act, I can't say enough good things about that. But I tried to think through a little bit myself, and I've written a chapter in the book about what some of the obstacles to accomplishing this, what we mean by reconciliation, what would be some avenues that were worthy of pursuit, because the 100th anniversary of the genocide will be with us in just 2 or 3 years. And I call this chapter Alone Together. And what I mean by that, I say at the end of that chapter, I say the stakes are high, but an effort toward normalization seems to me to be worth taking. Turks and Armenians can go it alone, each stating a position that the other will reject, or they could work together to try to find a common solution. I think that's worth pursuing. On the 2006 trip, the NAASR trip, I had an opportunity to meet with the then foreign minister of the Republic of Armenia. And he told me that Armenia was prepared to enter into negotiations toward the opening of the border and the reconciliation of these long-standing difficulties. But the Turks, he said, insisted on some preconditions, that the Armenians stop calling the events of 1915 a genocide, and that they give up any claims to properties or restitution of lost properties. There are lots of legal efforts underway now that I think are proper and should continue. Some $37 million was recovered by Mark Garagos, leading a legal team in California. There are other efforts underway, and I think they should continue. But I'm not sure it's in the Republic of Armenia's interest, or those of us who are Armenians living in other countries, to go on to a second 100 years of this without seeing if there isn't some honorable way, proper way, fair and reasonable way to try to come to some sort of reconciliation. Let me end these remarks with just a brief excerpt from something that I wrote about my mother, and then perhaps we might have some questions and comments and discussion. And I say, my mother's Bechstein piano is now in my son David's living room. His daughter Elisa sits at my mother's old piano bench, studying for her next recital. The piano is over 100 years old. It has piano legs, the squatty kind that are wide at the top and narrow at the bottom. The bench is just as old and is covered in a faded green needlepoint. There's a place to store music in the bench, on shelves behind a door with a metal handle. The piano keys are the original ivory ones, except for one or two that have been replaced with a synthetic material. They are whiter than the ivory ones and look like crowned teeth next to yellowing molars. On the piano there is a photograph of my mother, who was also named Elisa, sitting on the same bench, playing the same piano. She is wearing a long skirt, perhaps of brown velvet, and looks up with a pleasant expression at whomever it was who took the picture. I can't tell from the furniture or the look in the room or her appearance whether the picture was taken in Manchester, England, before my grandfather moved his family to California in 1911, or in the large house he built in his new homeland. But it really doesn't matter whether the photo was taken in the old country or the new, because my mother looks so self-assured and happy playing the piano. What is important is that the Elisa in the photograph and her great-granddaughter, Elisa, are together around a piano, a bench, and a shared love of music. Thank you very much.
Paul a chance to catch his breath. You, as I said, I've had the pleasure of reading the book, and you really hear in what Paul said tonight, not only when he was reading, but when he was just speaking extemporaneously, I might add, his voice. And his voice comes through in the book as well. And he's a good storyteller, and you know, if you hadn't taken a few wrong turns in life, you might have been an excellent novelist too. I want to mention now, before we get going on the Q&A, that of course, Now I Know in Part is available here tonight, and afterwards we'll banish Paul to the far end of the room, where we encourage you to purchase a book or two, which you'll be glad to sign, I know. Everything is 20% off tonight, including Now I Know in Part. There are refreshments, and there will be refreshments afterwards. And usually we do this at the very end of the evening. Usually we give our speakers something, and you never know what to give people, and especially someone like Paul Ignatius. So I decided that what we would give him is an old book that he can't read. And I'll explain that. A few weeks ago I was looking something up here in our library, and I stumbled across a familiar face. And the face was that of Avedis Jangocha, Paul's grandfather. And there's a nice little write-up here, which Rafi translated extemporaneously for me, because my Armenian is pretty poor. And it's the book is called Hishatakaran Yeprad College, Memoranda of Euphrates College. And indeed, there's a nice write-up on Mr. Jangochian as one of the early graduates and one of the major benefactors of Euphrates College. And if you don't read Armenian, you can at least make out in the middle of the write-up in English letters, California Soap Company. So, that caught my eye. So even though you can't read the book, you can look at it, and maybe you'll pick up Armenian at this stage. But I hope it will mean something to have.
Had you finished?
I'm done.
Look, the hour's late. I've talked longer than I should have, but if anybody has comments or questions, I'd be glad to respond. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, as a military person, have you studied the preparedness of Nagorno-Karabakh in light of Azerbaijan's heavy spending on their military?
No, to be honest, I haven't. I'm really not as knowledgeable as perhaps I should be about the details of the Nagorno-Karabakh situation or the relative strength of the military forces there. Yes, sir?
When you were in the Kennedy and Johnson administration, did you know of any other Armenians that had key positions like?
Oh, well, let me think for a moment. I don't offhand remember. There were undoubtedly people in the administration and in the civil service and the military of Armenian heritage, but in terms of the people I knew and worked with, I don't recall. I will tell you one thing, and this isn't responsive to your question, but a general observation. We are so torn as a country today where, I mean, quite literally, Republicans don't want to be photographed next to Democrats. I mean, it's really quite different from what it has been in certainly the recent past, and it's an illustration of this. When I went into the government in President Kennedy's administration in 1961, I was never asked if I was a Republican or a Democrat. I happened to have been a Democrat. I happened to have voted for President Kennedy, but the question wasn't asked. Now, we need to get a little bit more of that. I mean, one thing that was true was that we govern from the middle, and we tend now to govern, the loudest spokesmen are at the extreme. And I'm not damning any one party or the other. I think it's true. But there's so much that we have in common that we need to identify. But unfortunately, a lot of the senators who govern from the middle, Nancy Kassenbach, Sam Nunn, there are others who come to mind, are no longer around. And you find people following a very narrow agenda now, and it's that or nothing else. Yes, sir, Bob.
Oh, you didn't speak about your religious life, and I remember that you had a way of dealing with church when you weren't there. Do you remember that story?
I was baptized by Badveli Yuretyan at the Armenian church on Adams Boulevard in Los Angeles, and I never went to the church very much after that because my parents didn't either. My father was a pillar of the church, but he didn't earn that standing by going to church on Sundays, I'm afraid. He did it by helping to burn the mortgage, by raising money, helping to do a lot of worthwhile things. In his later life, as happens with so many people, I think he began to take his religion more seriously, and his attendance was a little better. Is that what you were?
No, I was referring to your rebroadcasting from the house.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Story.
Well, I'm not sure. I think that story's in the book. Yes, I know what you mean. At this old house in Tropico that grandfather John Gochin built, high up in the attic, in this big house. There's a picture of it in the book. One Sunday, my father and my mother, her sister Sybil, and several of her brothers went up into the attic, and my Uncle Matthew was a kind of technical wizard who built some kind of a crystal radio set. And my great-grandmother, whose picture also is in the book, Nana Hatun, was very unhappy because the younger generation weren't going to church. They were playing tennis on Sundays instead of going to church. So up in the attic, my father, who had a sort of deep, booming voice, gave a sermon, and down in the house, Nana Hatun had some earphones on her ears, and she was listening to this sermon. And the main idea of the sermon was the younger generation sort of gone to hell, so to speak. They don't go to church anymore. They should respect their parents more. What is going to happen to us? And Nana Hatun just nodding her head. And then Sybil and my mother and others sang some hymns, and she was listening to this on the crystal radio set. And then my father, as the preacher, asked that the plate be passed, and he jingled his keys in front of the microphone to make it sound like coins dropping in the tray. Anyway, when they went back down into the living room, Nana Hatun said to my father, Josep, I never heard Yanachan give a greater sermon than this one. And they didn't have the heart to tell her that the whole thing had been a spoof. That's the story. Any other? Yes, sir.
How did your family get the name Ignatius?
I'm not certain, but I've got two ideas as to how. The name was Ignatius. The story I had always heard was that my father's brothers, who preceded him by 8 years into this country and went to Pittsburgh, decided to shorten their name because Ignatiosyan was a kind of a mouthful. That's one story I heard. The other, I've heard that a number of people with long names from Poland or Armenia or whatever found in Ellis Island. My father came through Ellis Island. My grandfather arrived in Grander on the Lusitania with a pool table and a piano, and he was a prominent figure. But my father came through Ellis Island. And I've heard stories that some of the Irish clerks there would see a name like Ignatius and say, why don't you call it Ignatius, and a good old Irish name, something like that. So those are the two stories I've heard. I don't know either, but it happened 110 years, 115 years ago, and we've had that name since. Yes, ma'am.
Did you ever speak the Armenian language, or?
I know maybe 200 or 300 words of Armenian. I know some swear words, and I can do a little bit of.
Did your parents speak it?
My father spoke colloquial Armenian, spoke Haraper, he spoke classical Armenian. My mother grew up in England and she could speak Armenian, but she wasn't as fluent as my father. My parents spoke Armenian in our house, mainly when they didn't want the kids to hear what they were talking about. My father, I think, wanted me to succeed in his new country. He didn't want me to forget my heritage, but he didn't insist that I go to an Armenian school. I'm not necessarily advocating this one way or the other. I'm simply telling you the circumstance in which I grew up. I think it was partly because, as I said earlier, he had a foot in both the American community and the Armenian. He was Hofsep in one and HB or Joe in the other. My mother, having grown up in England, had a somewhat different background. She was less interested in Armenian issues than my father, although she did dedicate a lot of her time to the founding and continuation of this Armenian Allied Arts Association. Yes, sir, Bob?
Is the translation of your grandfather's work from Milton to Armenian available?
If it is, I don't know about it. I simply, it would be nice to know, and he spoke English well enough that he wanted to become a correspondent for a British newspaper in the Ottoman Empire. But I don't know if that book exists. Yes, ma'am?
Yes, just a point of inquiry.
Yes.
David Ignatius,
Yes.
the Washington Post, is
Yes.
he related to you?
He stands in my older older son and oldest child.
He's wonderful.
Thank you very much. David has been to Armenia several times, and he's going to be teaching at Harvard beginning after the first of the year at the Kennedy School. He's an expert on the Middle East.
Try not to miss him when he's on with
Well, thank you.
Charlie Rose.
Yes, he's been on that show
Yeah, many times.
a number of times, and he had a long career at the Wall Street Journal, as Adi did before going to the Post. Adi went to the Time magazine after his long career, bureau chief in Moscow, bureau chief in Beijing, and then went to Time, and then eventually ended up here in town as charge of the Harvard Business Review and also the other publications of the Harvard Business School. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting
Thank you. Thank you.
talk this evening. It was quite touched by it. As in your role as a Secretary of Defense,
Yeah.
did you ever have dealings with your counterparts in Turkey, and what might your reactions have been? You to them, then to you.
Yeah. The answer is no. I don't believe that I did have any contacts with any Turkish officials. I don't remember any if I did. For much of the time I was there, before I was Secretary of the Navy, my responsibility was in the business side of the Defense Department, procurement, supply, transportation, shipping, production. It was a job. Base closures. I hate to say this in this audience, but I was involved in the closing of Watertown Arsenal. And Springfield Armory. But my son now works in Watertown Arsenal, the headquarters of the Harvard Business Review, and we felt that a lot of these bases could serve a public use, pay taxes to the local community. At any rate, that was the sort of thing I did, and I didn't have any involvement there.
I would just add one thing,
Yes.
that all the names you added for these Armenians who made us distinguish themselves
Yes.
as citizens of this country and Armenia. We certainly need to add yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
The debt committee was unable to come to a compromise, and as a consequence, there are going to be draconian cuts in all kinds of spending, including the Defense Department. I think some of that spending, cuts is called for. What is your opinion on the result of that?
Well, I think the questions about the fiscal situation in our country now, we have been living beyond our means for a long time, and I think we need to get on top of it. And I don't think you should exempt the Defense Department from cuts. You've got to do it right in the fundamental sense that the government's primary responsibility is to keep us safe, and part of that responsibility, a large part of it, is in the Defense Department. So we don't want to do stupid things, but I don't think we should exempt them. I think about World War II when we were all together. My mother contributed some aluminum pans in the belief that somehow these pans were going to end up as wings on an airplane. Now, I don't know that they ever did, but the fact is that this was a way, one little way, in which we became involved. And again, I don't want to be partisan, Republican or Democrat, but we were told at the beginning of the war in Iraq that we should go out and shop. Well, that's one way to do it, but there's another way to somehow involve us more. And I spoke earlier about some of the divisions that exist today. But at any rate, in response to your question, I would not accept the Defense Department. How's our time?
We're fine. I have a question.
Yes.
No, uncut, no. You've been on the hot seat, so I'll give you an easy one. A few weeks ago, I got an email from a fellow who is writing a biography of Ruben Mamoulian, and I wrote back and answered some of his questions. And by the way, I know personally one of the surely only people around who starred in multiple Ruben Mamoulian films. So since you didn't touch on that, I wanted to ask you to, in a brief, give a capsule review of your film career.
He knows more than he should. Well, it's in the book. My parents, very close friends, were the Ruben Mamoulian's parents, and they came to our house a lot. Mrs. Mamoulian had been an actress in Tiflis in the old days, and still fancied herself as an actress, and she would appear in plays from time to time in Armenian to help raise money for a cause. At any rate, through the Mamoulians, I was a student in I guess junior high school, and I was and maybe in high school, acting in school plays, as so many kids do, and through that ended up in tiny little parts in three of Ruben's Mamoulians, and one of them, if you blinked your eye, you would have missed me. You would have missed me. But in another one called High, Wide, and Handsome, I had a speaking part, and Mamoulian said to me, it was late in the afternoon when my big scene came up, and he said, I want you to be one take, Paul, meaning let's get this done in only one take. Well, it took two, but it was at a climactic moment in a film called High, Wide, and Handsome, when Irene Dunn, who was the daughter of the head of a traveling circus, and her recently married husband worked in an oil field in Titus, Pennsylvania, and some bad guys were coming into the oil field to try to take over from the legitimate owners of the claim. And the Irene Dunn and Randolph Scott, her husband, are in their bedroom, and I won't put too fine a point on it, but just at the precise moment, there was a shout from below on this rainy night, and this little kid down there hollered up and said that there was trouble in the oil fields. And Irene Dunn said to Randolph Scott, if you leave this bedroom and go out to that oil field, I'll never see it. Well, that was me who was, that was my biggest thing. And I got paid $50 for it. And that was a hell of a lot of money. That's the great career.
There's another member of your family, having been the Secretary of Navy in the early 50s.
Another member of my family? The only Secretary of the Navy who had a name even remotely similar to mine was Paul Nitze. We had the same first names. Paul Nitze, I think, came from a German background, N-I-T-C-E, and I succeeded him actually as a Navy. Now there may have been some.
That's one, because when I was in the service in 51, 52, I used to catch hops from Washington area when there was a Fort Belvoir.
Yeah.
And the plane that I got a hop on, they sent the Secretary of Navy's plane.
Yeah.
It was an
What year was that?
Probably 50, 51.
Well, I don't, it wasn't me. My term was 67, but I don't know. I don't understand.
Thank you very much. Special request, those of you who are here now, who are on the 2006 trip, come up to the front of the room so we can take a picture, and then we're going to spring Paul to sign some books for you. And thank you very much for being here.
Huh? I gotta ask him a question. I wanted to ask something. Yeah, it really was more trivial. It's good to see you, Stan. Merry Christmas.
Get a function at the ARS Saturday.
Up and roll? Oh, I'll tell my wife. I've been there a couple of times.
I'll give Biggie and Son to
Are you big on speaking? He's good. He's a great speaker.
at 6 o'clock.
I'll tell my wife if I can. How's Angel doing? I'll mention it to Linda. Thank you, Steve. Now, I was going to ask you, my father's name, he met Brian while they did that, because he was taking a picture. When he moved to California, he changed the name from okay? Hastings. I was wondering, if his neighbors were Hastings, change the name, but I don't think so. They probably were real New England names. Oh, that was twins, yeah. Yeah. I'll go back in with my kids. He would have been 15 years old. How's school going? Here's a kid that I know, a friend of mine. He goes to Western State, University College. He's Armenian, so I'm helping him to get familiar with the Armenian community of Worcester. So he can do a documentary on the history of the Armenian settlement of Worcester. That was the first community. It's something I would do, except I don't want to go back and forth to Worcester. Yeah. Good night. Oh, then welcome back.
He can be your apprentice.
Well, that's